Welcome to the Frankly Speaking podcast, Friends of Europe's weekly broadcast on the topics of European and world affairs. Coming up this week.
The European Union is holding a summit of its own with the Western Balkan countries in Albania. So this does suggest that there maybe is a geopolitical moment in the Western Balkans.
The same elites, ethnic nationalist elites, are essentially entrenched in power in most of the Western Balkan countries, as were at the end of the time of the Yugoslav wars.
Good afternoon, everybody, and greetings from Brussels, from Paul Taylor and myself, Jamie Shea. Both of us are senior fellows at Friends of Europe, and welcome to this week's Frankly Speaking podcast. It will be, again, my pleasure to be the moderator, and today I'm going to interview Paul Taylor. The reason is that Paul is tomorrow going to launch in Brussels at the Friends of Europe Balkans Summit, his latest European security report. This is number 11, and having previously covered areas such as space, the Arctic, the Sahel, or the Black Sea, or the Mediterranean, and several European countries in between, this time round, Paul has chosen the Western Balkans. And the title of his 11th report is Seize the Geopolitical Moment, the Western Balkans and European Security. So, Paul, looking, of course, forward to your launch event to tomorrow, but we've also chosen a good day today, the eve of the Friends of Europe event, because, of course, the European Union is holding a summit of its own with the Western Balkan countries in Albania. So this does suggest that there maybe is a geopolitical moment in the Western Balkans. But my first question to you is, having covered so many other areas, did you go to the Western Balkans this time round because it was kind of Buggins' turn, a gap in your geographical European panorama, or was there something particularly interesting about the situation that drew your attention to that particular part of Europe?
Well, Jamie, thank you. I think there's a bit of both, to be honest. As I've done these reports, I've tried to pick out and highlight areas where Europe faces security challenges that may not be widely recognized. That was clearly the case in the Black Sea, which was widely regarded as a backwater and has turned out to be a bloody great theatre of war. Also true, I think, of the Arctic, the High North, a zone of considerable risk and strategic importance. The Sahel, as we've seen, hotly contested. The Mediterranean, where we haven't seen the end of fun and games there. But the Western Balkans somehow had been, in the words of my friend Ivan Krastev, a bit of a frozen solution rather than a frozen conflict. There was still plenty of unresolved conflicts there after the end of the Yugoslav wars. But everybody has sort of assumed that the solution was that these countries would gradually be absorbed into the Euro-Atlantic institutions, into NATO, into the European Union, and would, if not live happily ever after, then at least the threats that they pose in terms of potential instability would cease to exist. 20 years later, we're still nowhere, and therefore, with the outbreak of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, all of a sudden, those areas of unresolved problems that could start to be unpicked and that are still festering without a proper solution become more acute again. And that's why I decided to revisit the Western Balkans.
Well, Paul, your answer there leads me very nicely into the first sort of big question that I wanted to put to you today about your report. I mean, you're well known for not pulling your punches and for being balanced and fair, but also critical where criticism is deserved. And you mentioned these sort of frustrated hopes, these dashed expectations about where the Western Balkans should be these days. I mean, obviously, as you well know, Hundreds of thousands of NATO and EU soldiers have done their time there. Innumerable NGOs and other international organizations have tried very hard to help the Western Balkans with institution building in the economy. Why are we not further forward? I mean, is it that the West sort of got the strategy wrong, or lost interest, didn't push hard enough? Or is it the fact that we've got a sort of a bunch of local leaders in the region who just haven't sort of been up to the game and haven't had the sort of the wisdom to seize the opportunities? So if you have to sort of, point your finger at, where the blame lies, where would you point your finger?
I think there's plenty of blame to go around, Jamie, and I don't think you can entirely blame either side. But between them, they mutually reinforced the inertia. There was an old Soviet workers joke: we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. And the EU enlargement equivalent of that is: we pretend that we're reforming and they pretend they want us. And frankly, it's broken down on both sides. The same elites, ethnic nationalist elites, are essentially entrenched in power in most of the Western Balkan countries, as were at the end of the time of the Yugoslav wars. Doesn't mean there haven't been elections and some alternations in power, but by and large, most of the countries are still tightly in the grip of those ethnic nationalist parties, some of them led by individual charismatic autocrats. They run clientelistic systems. And from their point of view, why would they take the risk of giving up power and money for such a distant prospect of EU enlargement when there's no sign that the EU really wants them anytime soon, at any rate? And on the other hand, on the EU side, the fact is that after the Big Bang enlargement of the 2000s, when 12 countries joined the EU between 2004 and 2007, there was quite a widespread enlargement fatigue. Those countries were quite difficult to integrate and digest, and we've seen backsliding very prominently, in particular on the rule of law, media freedom, and so on, in Poland, and above all in Hungary, and to some extent in Slovenia and in Bulgaria. And therefore, this also was conflated with fears of uncontrolled migration. And the result of all that was that countries in Western Europe, particularly France and the Netherlands, where referendums were lost partly because of those factors, became very, very reluctant to see any more enlargement. And so without that magnet of enlargement, without the gravitational pull of enlargement, the region was somewhat left to fester, and that's what's happened. And to be fair, the EU's had a whole series of other pressing issues to deal with: the Euro crisis, the migration crisis, Brexit, the COVID-19 pandemic. And so there's always been other things higher on the agenda than the Western Balkans. And now people in the Western Balkans worry that with the war in Ukraine, maybe once again they're being pushed down the food chain. I think that's not quite the case.
Paul, yes, I mean, that last point again leads nicely to my next question. Thank you, Paul, for being so helpful to me in that respect. But as I mentioned in my brief introduction, today there is this EU summit taking place in Tirana, Albania. The fact that the EU leaders have traveled to the Western Balkans rather than summoning the Western Balkan leaders to come to Brussels, I suppose is symbolic and important. And this does sort of suggest that in response to the stagnation that you've described, this time the EU is going to sort of give it another go, right? Has a new strategy, a new sort of determination. I mean, how do you read this? Do you think that this time around the EU is showing sort of more determination, is likely to be more successful than some of the sort of the reboots of the Western Balkan strategy that we've seen coming from Brussels in the past?
Well, I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine has finally raised awareness of the strategic importance of the Western Balkans again in the EU, that it's a sort of dangerous grey zone there inside EU territory, with a big potential for destabilization in various ways: migration, crime, weapons smuggling, people smuggling, drug smuggling, and so on, and the possibility of violence that could suck in third parties, outside powers. So yes, this year, there have been two of these summits, and the first time that one in the Western Balkans. There's been a revival of the Berlin process, which is about trying to create a regional economic market and help prepare those countries better for joining the EU. There have been new investments in energy and transport corridors, and at long last, the start of negotiations for membership with Albania and North Macedonia, which had been long and disgracefully stalled. And then perhaps some practical decisions that affect the people's everyday lives, like a decision to gradually introduce them into the European Union telephone roaming zone so that they pay less telephone charges. And the prospect of granting Kosovo, finally the last country that hasn't got it, visa liberalization, which means that Kosovo's, but only from the beginning of 2024. And if this goes through, we'll be able to visit Europe for the EU for 90 days without a visa. But more has to be done, because that in itself is a good start, but it's not a clear strategy. And what we need is to have more of the benefits of membership accruing to these countries earlier in their accession process. At the moment, we have a sort of everything or nothing system where they get, a small dribble of pre-accession aid, and then all of a sudden, the day they eventually join, they get up to 4% of GDP bunged at them, and often have difficulty absorbing it. So it makes much more sense to give people more tangible benefits earlier on in the process, and that also gives them better incentives to make those difficult reforms. A more for more strategy is what's needed.
Okay, but Paul, one of the reasons why people sometimes believe that the EU is sort of re-engaging, and to some degree the US as well, is a fear that a vacuum has been left, which Russia and China. Sometimes people also mention sort of Turkey or Saudi Arabia, other outside powers, even Iran. You and I have both heard mentioned in the past. These sort of adversarial powers are coming in, so it's a kind of zero-sum game. More influence for us means less for them, and vice versa. You've looked at this. Do you think that this notion of a challenge in the region for influence from Russia and China is overhyped, or is there enough sort of evidence out there to really make it urgent now for the EU to reassert itself?
Well, look, Russia is certainly doing what it can through diplomacy at the United Nations, disinformation, media control, and using the leverage of its massive energy hold over particularly Serbia and Bosnia to divide, to fan Slavic Orthodox nationalism in the region, to sow a distrust of the EU and NATO, and to exploit societal and ethnic divisions. No doubt about that. Both Russia and China are helping to rearm Serbia. But perhaps we shouldn't exaggerate it. Russia is clearly distracted by the war in Ukraine. It's got other problems on its plate. And some Russian strategists have argued that Moscow essentially accepted in the early 2000s that the Western Balkans was inevitably on its way towards the West, and that when Russia pulled its own peacekeepers out of Kosovo in 2004, I think it was a sort of sign that it had basically lowered its ambitions in the region. That, of course, could still change, and Russia could look to the Balkans as somewhere where it would want to sort of at least try and destabilize and embarrass the EU and the West. So one has to be on one's guard, and above all, not leave a vacuum. Chinese influence is more economic. It's through the Belt and Road Initiative, big projects, infrastructure, but also diplomatic engagement with what was the 17 and I believe is now shriveled to the 14+1 grouping, and attempts therefore to build a dependent clientele in the EU's soft underbelly. Do I think that all of that adds up to a great threat? I mean, Turkey is a different case, Turkey was the imperial power in the region for centuries. So Turkey is part of the Balkans, and Turkey's influence is, I think, largely benign. But of course, what would happen, for example, if the Russians were to provoke or to encourage the Bosnian Serbs into declaring their independence, and then the Bosniaks, the Muslim Bosniaks, were to turn to their Turkish brothers and say, please, can we have some of those Bayraktar drones that are being so effective for Ukraine? You know, you don't have to, I don't have to paint you a picture of what might happen. But you know, I think the other influence that we haven't talked about, but I think is important, is one of our own member states and NATO allies, Hungary. Hungary wields a big influence. It's a neighbor, particularly in Serbia, but around the region. It owns some of the media, and it is pushing, Viktor Orban is pushing his own illiberal form of authoritarian governance down there. And therefore, in a way, you've got two struggles going on, not one. You've got parallel struggles on the one hand between the West and Russia and China over geopolitical influence, but you've also got a struggle between the European liberal democratic model, the Brussels model, if you like, and the Orban-Vucic model, if I can call it that, perhaps Orban-Vucic-Erdogan model of a sort of illiberal, authoritarian kind of democracy. And I think the jury's still out on which way that will go in the region.
Yes, Paul, you mentioned Alexander Vucic, the president of Serbia, because I also wanted to ask you about Serbia. In the old Yugoslavia, it was very much, the dominant entity, particularly when it came to industrial and military power. Since the breakup of course, of the former Yugoslavia, the question is which way is it going to go? Is it going to go to the east, given these strong relations with Russia, to some extent China? It has a strong foot in the authoritarian camp, or as a candidate for EU membership, which has actually started to negotiate the various chapters, it's looking to the West. And I suppose it's been rather convenient for the Serbs to sort of play this sort of 1 foot in, 1 foot out sort of double game. But of course, if Serbia cannot accept that, for example, the independence of Kosovo and recognition, well, we're not likely to solve that particular issue. If, as you said, it encourages the Republika Srpska to try to break away from Bosnia, it could still be a factor of instability. So are we going to be frustrated with Serbia for years to come, or do you think there will come a point where Vucic will realize that he has to make a choice of Moscow versus Brussels, and which way do you think it's going to go? And do we have any levers of influence over Belgrade in terms of making it sort of live up to the European values if it really is serious about being a member of the EU?
Well, we do have some levers, and I think you can see that there's been a subtle shift in Vucic's positioning. He's always tried to play all sides off against each other to get the best advantage for himself and for Serbia. He gets cheap energy from Russia, and he's still very dependent on that. But he now realizes that making himself and his country so dependent on Russia was not a smart idea. And so he's rushing to try and get interconnectors built with Greece, with Bulgaria, with Hungary, so as to try and reduce his dependence on Russian energy. And as he does that, he has voted for all the resolutions at the United Nations condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine and for expelling Russia from the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. On the other hand, he has not aligned himself with the EU sanctions against Russia. He still allows flights from Moscow, direct flights from Moscow to Belgrade. There's a lot of young Russians have moved to Serbia, both because both supporters of the war potentially, who want to put their money in a safe place, and opponents of the war, who there are opposition groups active in out of Belgrade as well. I think in the long term, Vucic clearly sees that his interest is with the European Union, but Serbia has a complex history. Many Serbs, a majority of Serbs, are still deeply resentful of NATO over the bombing of Serbia in 1999 during the Kosovo War. And so, there is strong sympathy in a part of the population in Serbia for Russia. And there's also a belief that they'll never get into the EU. And therefore, it's the country in the region where support for EU membership is lowest at about 36, 37% currently. That said, I think that, as Vucic is a realist, he sees Russia's power being weakened in this war. And, I think that he can see the writing on the wall. But in order for him to make bigger moves towards aligning with the EU and bigger moves in terms of making the reforms and rule of law and pluralism that he will need to make to advance. And you mentioned Kosovo, also advancing in the normalization of relations with Pristina. He will have to see bigger, more tangible rewards in the foreseeable future for himself and for Serbia.
Paul, we had a hot autumn, unfortunately, in the Western Balkans. I've been covering quite closely, as you have, this almost conflict between Kosovo and Serbia over the issue of license plates for the ethnic Serb community living in the north of Kosovo. There were reports at one stage that Belgrade had mobilized forces heading towards Kosovo. Belgrade accused the Kosovars of launching drones into Serbia. It was, all a bit murky, to be frank, but it did sort of, cause a lot of pandemonium in Washington, in Brussels. People worked the phones with Albin Kurti, the Kosovar leader, as well as Alexander Vucic, calling for de-escalation. And they seemed, for the time being, to have come to some kind of an agreement on license plates. But it did sort of suggest that, we can't be complacent, that war could break out again. You mentioned also the situation with Republic Srpska. So is this are we dealing with sort of pantomime bellicism, if you like, or do you think that, some of these unresolved issues could really reignite, if not quite to the same extent as we saw in the 1990s, but could nonetheless really rekindle a conflict?
Well, even pantomime bellicism can get out of hand, out of control. A return to the 1990s scale Yugoslav wars, I think, is very unlikely. You have a war-weary population. You have a collective memory of suffering. You have few young trained fighters. And of course, you have the residual EU and NATO peacekeeping presence in the region. Plus, many of the countries of the region have become members of NATO, although not, of course, Serbia or Bosnia. However, political violence, as we've seen, is very possible and indeed has occurred a couple of times this year, notably over the license plates in northern Kosovo. And the problem with that kind of sort of political violence is you can clamp a lid on it, but there's always the risk that it gets out of hand, or that a single incident, a hand grenade in a mosque, a house burned down, can take on a life of its own, and all of a sudden people are taking up arms, and you're into some kind of a shooting conflict. Now, I think the most likely cause of a flare-up is still the very raw relations between the Kosovo Serbs and the Kosovo government. And I have to say that Mr. Kurti, while he's done a lot in terms of domestic, economic, and just judicial reform in a short time, has been particularly intransigent, I would say, inflexible in the diplomatic process. And I think that, US and EU diplomats are tearing their hair out at Kosovo's kind of the difficulty in getting Kosovo to accept what they see as common sense arrangements. And However, the thing that could really, I think, be the most dangerous would be if the Bosnian Serbs were to actually make good on these threats to declare independence, to break away from the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I don't think that's very likely. They've already postponed it, I think, twice now, blaming it on the sort of the international situation and so on, which may be that, because their Russian patron is distracted. But then I think that that's something that would almost inevitably lead to some kind of conflict if they were, and there's a very long demarcation line there between Republika Srpska and the Bosnian, the Federation of the Bosnian Croats and the Bosniak Muslims. And, problems could occur anywhere on that front line. The small EU peacekeeping force concentrated in the Sarajevo Valley with no real way of getting to the possible theatre of conflict on time.
Yeah, well, Paul, that's balanced, but it's sobering nonetheless. It suggests that those NATO forces in Kosovo and the EU residual EU forces in Bosnia are not going to be sort of coming home anytime soon. As we come to the closing couple of minutes of our podcast this afternoon, two things really to ask you just before we wrap up. You're traveling in the region. Where is the hope for the future? Where are those green shoots that we can build on? And Friends of Europe, we like very much, as you know, and this will be also on the agenda tomorrow, to look at sort of citizens' engagement, grassroots, civil society, the pressure from below of people who, don't want to play petty politics, who want their leaders to get on with it. We look at, the private sector, small and medium-sized enterprises, the innovation culture, which is there. It's compared with Europe, it has a sort of young population, doesn't it, the region, particularly Kosovo. So did you sort of see anything where you thought, well, this is a success story, this is the kind of thing we need to build on?
I think there are plenty of hopeful signs, as you say, at the grassroots level. You see it also in the fact that that power does change hands in elections in places like Montenegro, in North Macedonia, that countries are prepared to go to great lengths to achieve the European goals, such as, for example, the North Macedonians changing the name of their country. I mean, can you imagine if France or Germany had to change the name of the country just to start negotiations to join the EU, and then discovered after having changed their name that, well, actually, they can't yet start the negotiations because there's another set of conditions to be met. So, no, I mean, there's those kinds of hopes. There's a big clean out going on of the judiciary in Albania to produce a new, more honest and better trained judiciary, which should in turn help in the fight against corruption and organized crime. There are green shoots, and I think the three countries where I see particularly encouraging developments are Albania, North Macedonia, and Montenegro, although each has its internal problems. But the thing is, the EU must do more to reward that progress, because you sometimes get the feeling that the EU is engaging a lot with Serbia because Serbia is the biggest. It's a third of the population of just under 18 million in the Western Balkans, and it's the country with perhaps the best organized state, the biggest administrative capacity, but it's certainly not the most advanced in terms of meeting the EU's conditions. And so I think there's encouragement there. There's encouragement where young people want to stay and build tech centers in the region, and it should get more EU support for that. For where women are creating business, startup businesses and so on. All those sorts of things are creating the social fabric. But the EU has traditionally worked with a mixture of top-down pressure for reform and bottom-up engagement with civil society. We've got to do better and more at the bottom-up engagement with civil society.
Okay, well, Paul, the last question, and because we're out of time, I'm going to have to ask you to sort of just answer this in headline fashion, if you don't mind. And of course, people who will be hungry for more can, of course, read your report when it is out, and therefore published also on the website of Friends of Europe in due course, and available from tomorrow onwards. But as always, when you do these studies, you come up with a series of recommendations. Many of them can't go through them all tonight, but imagine you had the opportunity to sort of put on the table of the EU summiteers in Tirana this evening the three top recommendations, the priority of priorities to really unlock some of this stagnation. What would be your sort of top three?
I think the absolute top priority is making more of the benefits of EU membership available earlier on in reward for progress for candidates, and making it a gradual step-by-step integration, with more political integration, with more of their ministers attending our meetings, and with observers and coming to the European Parliament and so on, getting them more engaged with us earlier in the game, and giving them a bigger incentive to make the reforms. That's the number one. Number two, is to make sure that we've got our peacekeepers talking to each other, NATO and the EU, exercising with each other, able to reinforce each other, involved, and keep, with the diplomacy on both sides, so that if anything were to go wrong, making sure that we're well prepared there. And number three, I think for the peoples of the region is, we can't do it all for you. The EU has to a degree neglected you. It's left a lot of problems to fester, but those festering problems are your problems, and you've got to want and make the efforts for change. And the question is there of whether there's some sort of Balkan, Central European form of governance that is somehow unadaptable to the EU. I don't believe that, but there are a lot of people that will try and convince you of that. And if that were the case, well, then things are going to be the future is going to be much less bright for your region.
Well, Paul, thanks very much for taking us through your new study. Bismarck is reputed to have said once that the Balkans were not worth the bones of a healthy Pomeranian grenadier. I think you've convinced us that this is not true. Bismarck could get it wrong occasionally. This is a region of strategic importance for Europe. Europe needs to re-engage, but as you said at the end, local leaders also have their responsibility. But certainly there is a way forward. Paul, well, one of the things you always do in your studies is not only describe the maze very well, but you lead us into it and you lead us back out. And so thanks again on behalf of Friends of Europe for a great study. Anxious to know what the next is going to be, but that will be the subject of another podcast in 6 months' time. But for now, thanks again to Paul Taylor, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe. Paul, I should have said at the beginning, of course, is also a distinguished former diplomatic correspondent of Reuters and a columnist for Politico, amongst many other activities. Paul, wishing you a successful launch tomorrow, and many readers for your study. So that's it from this week's Frankly Speaking podcast. On behalf of Paul and I, and with thanks as always to Sean Flynn and the communications team at Friends of Europe. Hope you enjoyed this one, and there'll be another one coming your way very soon. Bye for now.
That's it for this Frankly Speaking podcast. Consider subscribing to our newsletter or following us on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, or Facebook. And don't forget to tune in again, this time next week.